Well, let me say clearly, I am replacing my words of concession with an uncompromised and unapologetic call that we count every single vote.
It's almost a week since the U.S. midterm elections, and the dust hasn't settled in two key Florida races. Over the weekend, the state ordered a recount of more than 8 million ballots. Initial counts had the Republican candidates leading by razor-thin margins. That decision has prompted lawsuits, protests, and allegations of voter fraud. U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted this morning that the Florida election should be called in favor of the two Republican candidates, saying, quote, "An honest count is no longer possible because the ballots are massively infected." Election officials have until Thursday to complete their recounts. But is it even possible that a recount will move the needle? And why are some Republicans alleging voter fraud? Nick Nehamas is an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, and he joins me now from Miami. Hi, Nick. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your time. Help us understand a bit about what prompted this recount.
Well, what prompted the recount is that Florida, and it's amazing because it's such a big state, is very, very evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats and, independents who can go either way. The margins in our elections, and, we're talking 8 million voters, can come down to a few thousand people going one way or the other.
Tell me a bit about what in both the races, the governor one and the Senate one, what's behind how close things were, do you think?
Well, I think the numbers in this state are pretty even. In the governor's race, you had the Democratic candidate, Andrew Gillum, who was able to drive a lot of votes in the more liberal urban areas, especially in the African-American community, because Gillum himself is African-American. And you had him against the Republican Ron DeSantis, who's much more closely aligned with President Donald Trump. And so he was able to draw out the older voters, the whiter voters, the more conservative voters, certainly some Cuban Americans down in Miami. And, the way the math works out, it's just the numbers are very, very close. There was a similar dynamic in the Scott Nelson race, which is actually only separated by 12,000 or so votes right now. But really what it comes down to is just that there's an incredibly similar number of Republicans and Democratic voters in this state. Unlike, most states in the U.S., especially the big ones, are solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. Florida is just a huge swing state.
You mentioned both of the sort of the margin of either victory or loss, 13,000 in the Senate race or 12,500, and just a little over 30,000 in the other race. Is it possible for a recount to really swing either of those races very much?
I think that the Gillum-DeSantis race is more unlikely. It's still within the margin for an automatic recount, a machine recount. After the 2000 election, which was, a mess, Florida changed its election laws so that recounts could happen automatically. The Senate race is much closer. 12,000 is still a big, big gap for Senator Nelson to make up. But there is an issue of undervoting where he could gain some votes in a liberal county, the county of Broward, because there are some ballots where there was a vote for governor in the other races, but not a vote for Senate. And people are trying to figure out if that was a design flaw on the ballot, which people just didn't notice the Senate race and didn't vote in it. And in that case, it wouldn't help Nelson. Or if there was an issue with the machines counting the ballots that maybe somehow systemically did not record votes for Nelson that exist. And those would be tallied up in a hand recount. But the point is, yes, 12,000 votes is a lot to make up no matter what.
And Nick, what about the allegations of voter fraud coming from Rick Scott and Donald Trump? Do you have any idea where those are coming from?
Well, the governor and the president have made very loud accusations of voter fraud, but there has simply been no evidence that anyone has reported yet. What's interesting in Florida is that, usually Governor Scott's administration hews quite closely to his message. But in this case, the Florida Department of State, which runs the elections in Florida, came out in public and said that they had seen no evidence or heard no evidence of voter fraud. So they're really stepping on the boss's message, so to speak, which is unusual and shows the extent that, you know, these accusations are troubling to people who closely follow elections, because there is just no evidence right now.
What's the strategy then behind making the accusations, and does it position, for example, Rick Scott to be position him so that he can say that the results of the recount are thereby not valid?
Well, that's one theory. I think, you know, Senator Rubio has also been quite adamant in criticizing local election officials in Broward and Palm Beach, who are certainly not, you know, blameless in terms of their competence, perhaps, or how quickly they're counting up these votes, why they're so far behind the other counties. But I do think you're right. It's a strategy to maybe end this recount sooner than it might otherwise end and undermine people's confidence in the election.
And Rick Scott is also suing to require law enforcement officials to seize ballots and tallying machines in 2 counties. Is there any way that the lawsuits, and there's some anticipation there could be more, might actually impact what happens in the recount? Could it prolong it? Could it stop it? What's your take on that?
Yes, it could definitely prolong the recount. In fact, in that last lawsuit you just mentioned, a judge just in the last few minutes ruled that the voting machines should not be seized, but he did allow for extra police officers to be stationed in the voting center headquarters in Broward County. But, I mean, this recount could last the entire month of November.
For us sitting up here north of the border, before I let you go, I have to ask, you know, why does this appear to keep happening in Florida? We all remember Bush versus Gore. I read that there had been improvements to the machines and the technology, but that there wasn't, I guess they were anticipating 5 million voters and not 8.5 million. Is that what's attributable here, or what is it?
Well, I think, yeah, the turnout was higher than expected, but I think the problem is that, you know, especially Broward County has just had problems in its elections office going back years and years, you know, which the Herald and other local newspapers have covered pretty extensively. And the problems here are really centered in Broward County. And so I think it's up to local officials there to figure out, why is it taking so long to count these ballots? Miami-Dade, where we are, it's actually a bigger county, is well ahead of Broward in counting these ballots. So it seems like, you know, there has to be some improvements made in the Broward Supervisor of Elections office.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Appreciate your time.
Okay, good luck. Thank you.